Hi, welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. Today's opinions will be about The Cloud Roads by Martha Wells. So, The Cloud Roads follows a man named Moon, a guy who has spent his life traveling from one community to another, trying desperately to find a place that he can fit in. But he never gets to stay anywhere for long, because as soon as his new community realizes what he is, he ends up having to flee. Because what he is a shapeshifter. He shifts between a form that is relatively normal for this world, like a basic bipedal, with soft, fleshy skin, hair, you know, normal stuff. But his other form has scales, wings, a tail, spines around his head, and in this world, there are some wildly different physical forms. But the problem is that Moon's other form looks dangerously like the evil, man-eating, world-conquering creatures called the Fel. Moon has no idea what he is because he's been alone most of his life, but he knows he is not a Fel. But when one of the women he is living with sees his winged form, she and the rest of the community decide that Moon is a Fel and tries to kill him. He is only saved by a random appearance of another shapeshifter. One like him, but bigger. Moon finally finds out what he is, but when he follows this other shifter, Stone, back to his home colony, he discovers that he might not fit here either. But he has promised to stay until Stone can get the colony moved, and sticking around will mean fighting the Fel, desperately trying to save people he barely knows, barely gets along with, and is not sure if he will ever see again after he leaves. I'm gonna be honest, this one was a bit of an odd book. Fantasy has magical races. It's one of the core tropes of the genre. And these races are traditionally very similar to humans. We're talking about elves who look like humans but tall, pretty, with pointy ears, or dwarves who look like short, stocky humans with beards and an obsession with mining. We sometimes get creatures like merfolk, centaurs, naga, and other half-humans, but there's a reason that these are traditionally referred to as fantasy races and not species. They're very similar to human across the board. Also, they tend to fit well-known accepted categories, like we are looking at orcs, dwarves, elves, goblins. Even books that don't actually call their characters elves, dwarves, or whatever, they still distinctly fit in those roles. And this book seemed to just sort of say, fuck that, and do something entirely different. This book's got green people, this book has people with tusks, this book has people with shells, people with feathers. There are three main classes in this world: the people who walk, the people who fly, and the people who swim. But beyond that, it was pretty clear that Wells was actively trying to create a collection of weird races from scratch. These are not reminiscent of actual historical mythological creatures. These are just something new. And she wanted a wildly diverse world. And in that way, it sort of reminded me more of sci-fi than fantasy. Like, that's the genre where we get, like, weird and wonderful body types and designs. And it's not just the physical forms that are different in this book. We also see we don't see a huge amount about the different cultures that Moon moves through, but what we do see is people wearing wildly different clothing, living in different types of communities, different buildings, different social structures, with different societal norms. And like in a lot of sci-fi, these different cultures coexist relatively peacefully. They trade with each other, they travel through each other's lands, they live together in cities and towns. Yeah, Moon personally has trouble fitting in anywhere, but it's made very clear that he is an unusual case. And it's solely because his race, the Raksura, happen to look like the only really evil race. And that's one of the things I really do want to talk about with this book. Not only does this book feature a traditional evil race, the Fel eat other people, they destroy shit just cuz, they conquer lands, and they treat their mindless minions as expendable. But there's also the fact that the Raksura are a race with distinctive castes. Like, some are born to be hunters, some to be teachers, others to be warriors, and some to be queens. And each caste has its own character traits, its own physical like differences and innate skills that make them better for each individual role. And because of these two facts, this is a book that very much lives in the trope of predestined nature. Like, this is a world where some people are just born to act certain ways. And this is a trope you don't actually see in a lot of fantasy nowadays. It's sort of gone out of fashion. Or it's all about deconstructing this trope. Like, you'll see a lot more dwarves who hate living underground and want to be tap dancers than dwarves who are actually obsessed with mining. And I think this is mostly a pushback against the idea that anyone is born better than anyone else, that some are born with the right to rule, and some are born inherently evil, and some people are just born to act certain ways. And I know this is because a lot of these tropes in fantasy have been tied to racism in the real world. Like, yeah, a lot of fantasy goblins are just really bad, terrible stereotypes of Jewish people. And when you're playing with those traditional fantasy races and their traditional character traits, it's real easy to fall into perpetuating harmful stereotypes. And even if, like this book, we are pretty far from those traditional fantasy races, a lot of people, me included, push back against the notion that anyone must follow whatever role they're born into. So this is a difficult trope to start with. And it made me very nervous when I realized that that was a major element of this world. But this book is doing something interesting with this trope, even though it's not, like, actively deconstructing it. I don't think it's a spoiler to say this, but the Raksura are related to the Fel. Like, I figured it out, like, before I figured out the rest of the world, I already knew that fact. So I don't feel like this is ruining some surprise for you later on. But when you combine the relationship between the Raksura and the Fel, and a couple of cases of characters who seem to step out of their traditional roles, it sort of hints that there's something a lot more complicated and complex than the simple trope played straight of, like, oh, this is what you're born to be. And so I'm really hoping that this series continues to examine that and it continues to explore it, just because I think it would be more interesting. Though also, the Raksura casts seem to be heavily inspired by bees, which is just an interestingly complex cultural structure to start with for a sentient race. It's pretty cool. Also, the other thing that I noticed about the cultures in this book is they seem to be a lot more primitive than you tend to see in fantasy. Like, there's a lot more living in tents, windows covered with parchment, weapons made out of bone, and hunting and gathering than you tend to see in a lot of fantasy. Like, this is less medieval fantasy and more Iron or Bronze Age fantasy, but at the same time, this world is also, like, full of ruins from previous cultures and races that had been wiped out. And this provides this feeling of depth of time to the book. Like, you can sort of feel the centuries and maybe even millennia of lost history behind the book. And it makes it feel very complex, and like the world is a lot more complicated and we're just brushing the surface of it, which I love, because that means that the other ones in the series, because I know there are more in the series, has somewhere interesting to go. One of the things I love specifically about the Raksura culture is that there's this general vibe that their culture puts a lot less emphasis on romance than other relationships. Like, yeah, there is a bit of romance here. Moon does end up with a partner, but the first real bonds he builds in the Raksura colony are platonic ones. It's also directly stated that the Raksura have queens and consorts who are bonded to each other, but both the queens and the consorts regularly sleep with other Raksura too. The Raksura young are actually raised by teachers, not their parents. And while, yes, some of them do seem to have special attachments to clutchmates, and at least some form of attachment to their parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents, but they're not separated into family units. Basically, they're a lot more communal than most cultures, and this makes Moon's friendships within the colony as important, if not more important, than the relationship he has to the queens. Which is just something I like seeing in books. It's interesting, even though it does tend to make me prone to shipping everyone with everyone ever, like, oh my god. But I also want to talk about the character of Moon. He's a really odd character. In the beginning of the book, it's honestly a bit hard to follow because there's just so much world building. It's so hyper stuffed with peoples and cultures and magic and geography that is not super familiar. And Moon is the perfect character for this segment of the book because he seems really simple at first. Like, he seems rather passive and maybe a little bit dumb, and he's clearly motivated by one thing: getting along. And yeah, that motivation stays with us throughout the book. Like, that is his primary motivation through the entire thing. But we get to see much more of his character when we see him in different situations. It becomes pretty clear that he is a character who is used to fitting into whatever role a community has for him, and therefore adapting himself to his surroundings. He is simple and dumb with the Cordons because that's the way he can go unnoticed in that community. Later, when he's with the Raksura, he's more active, more protective, and more standoffish. And at least to me, it's pretty clear that he's doing this partially because that's what people expect him to do. There is one specific point where he stands up for himself and refuses to be pushed around, and that's sort of when the character snaps into focus. Like, suddenly we can really see who he is under the masks that he has worn to not draw attention to himself. And the transition is perfectly timed because it comes right at the moment that the reader has a pretty good, like, understanding of the world. Like, you have the world firmly in your mind. And so you are sort of craving a bit more information about the character, and you want to follow him a bit more. So we no longer need Moon to be a cipher, a blank who is just leading us through the world building. And from that point on, the book becomes more about Moon's needs, desires, and choices. The one downside I can see to this is that there's a big reveal about Moon's past that comes like 3/4 of the way through the book, and it felt to me like it came out of nowhere, but it didn't. Like, there were hints about it. The problem is, the hints that there was something hidden there all came in the segment where Moon is more of a blank and a cipher, and his character hasn't come into sharp focus. And in some weird way, this made it feel like all those hints were about something hidden about the world or the Raksura, not about Moon. So when the big reveal came about Moon, I was like, wait, what? That wasn't foreshadowed in the least. But it was, it just didn't feel like it was. I should also warn you that, like other books I've read by Martha Wells, there is some dark shit in this book. There's violence, threat of and reference to sexual violence, a lot of death and destruction, but to me it doesn't feel extremely heavy. Like, we don't get a lot of details about any of the really horrifying shit, which makes the book a lot easier to read, and it's a lot easier to just enjoy the fun adventure and not be super affected by these really dark moments. The only real negative I have for this book is a nitpicky one. Because the Raksura are shapeshifters, and a huge portion of Moon's emotional journey is tied up in being able to shift, there are about 7 million times when the book says the words, this character shifted to Groundling, that character shifted to Ariat, that character shifted to Arbura, this character shifted to have wings, and it just occasionally read as a bit repetitive. But I don't really think there's much to be done about it. It's like the he said and she said that is necessary to dialogue sometimes. It's necessary text, and if you try to dress it up too much, you're gonna start to sound ridiculous. So this is not a big thing, it's just something that drew my attention more than I wanted it to. Overall, I really liked this book. I don't think I liked it quite as much as I liked Wizard Hunters, but I liked it enough that I'm fighting the urge to immediately pick up the next one. I'm honestly not sure what it is about Martha Wells that just draws me into her books so intensely. Again, I picked this book up and expected to, take a while to read it, and read it in 3 sittings. It honestly would have probably been 2 sittings, except for the fact I had to go to a funeral. And I know, you're probably thinking, but that's such a small book. It only looks short because it's a tall, thin book with relatively small text. I'm pretty sure if this was printed as a normal mass-market paperback, it would be 300 to 400 pages. So not super long, but not short either. Basically, though, this book is just the perfect book for me. It's a perfect mix of lovely characters, creative world building, actiony story, and pretty descriptions. It's got a really good balance between dark and playful. It's got a great balance between expected tropes and new concepts. It's just exactly what I look for in a good book. So yeah, Martha Wells just happens to be my kind of author. I never say this in these videos because I hate the fact that every YouTuber says it, but screw it. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Also, comment on my videos. I get really sad when nobody comments on my videos. I like hearing from people.